One of the things that I really enjoy doing is just fixing things in general. So my brother gave me a bit of a challenge, and here's how the project went together. It all started with this text message that just says Susan at Main Street gave me a bunch of instruments for the podcast room, and it looks like maybe this ukulele could be repaired. I would say I was skeptical. It kind of almost looks like a bomb went off. But, I enjoy fixing stuff, so I thought I would give it a try. So here I'm just doing an examination of the ukulele, trying to figure out, what it's got, what's broken, what isn't. You can see if I put a little bit of downward pressure on it, it reveals a couple of different problems. One, the fretboard is separating from the neck, and then of course it's completely separated from the ukulele itself. You can also see pieces of wood sticking off of the heel there of the neck, and we'll get a better shot of that in just a second. And here's a little close-up of just how much separation there is between the fretboard and the neck. I'm going to go about trying to put all that back together here very, very shortly. You can see there again, there's the slices of wood sticking off of the heel block, and I decided to actually trim those off. I didn't cut them flush. I actually used a razor blade and undercut them so that I would have a little more control over them as I was putting them back together. Here, just looking at the top, you can see how much wood ripped out, and that actually ended up becoming helpful because some of the scraps of wood from the torn apart veneer here on this, it's a plywood, top, back, and sides, but you can see how the top part of the veneer of the plywood is separated from the rest, or the next layer down. I mean, it was a tremendous amount of destruction that happened to this, and I could kind of figure that the headstock must have been resting on something, and then somebody must have stepped on the ukulele or something, put a lot of down pressure on the body. So here I'm going to use a PVA glue, just a regular wood glue. If this was a super fancy instrument, I would most likely be trying to use something that's a little easier to reverse, like fish glue or a hot hide glue. But this is just a ukulele that, quite frankly, at this point is absolute garbage. So I'm not worried at all about which glue I'm using. But PVA glue, wood glue like this is pretty common for instrument makers to use, especially amateur instrument makers or people who are making instruments that aren't like heirloom quality, something you're going to pass down or use as a professional. So I go ahead and just get a bunch of glue on this, and then I'm going to glue the part of the missing veneer individually, just to make sure that I get really, really good coverage on this, because I really need it to stick down and stay down. So here we go, just slotting it into place. And like I say, I cut it off of the heel block so that I would be able to have this level of precision and not just be trying to stick everything down and not knowing if the neck was going to seat down perfectly onto the body, and then maybe these little broken pieces of veneer wouldn't have glued down appropriately. But they ended up going in really well. I'm trying to just use tools I have available in my shop. So these clamps just barely make it the width of the body. And so I was able to get that locked down. Then I was able to just glue up the opposite side, so just basically repeating the process. But there towards the left side of the screen, that piece of missing veneer right there was truly missing. It wasn't anywhere to be found. So I had to get creative on that particular piece. And ultimately what I ended up doing is cutting it off of the underside of the fretboard. Here, just a quick showing the glue up of the fretboard back onto the neck, and got it clamped up with some little Harbor Freight clamps, and they seem to work just fine. trying to deal with some of the squeeze out here so I can save myself a little bit of trouble down the road. That's looking pretty good. It ended up coming together really nice. So next day, time to pop the clamps. Make a nice little satisfying snap, which is kind of fun. You can see that came down really nice. It's very well glued on, and not a whole lot of cleanup to do here. When I glue, just catching the camera there. I don't have a good setup for filming this, but I'll work on that as I work on additional projects. But, you know, for a first attempt at filming a repair, hopefully you guys aren't losing your minds trying to watch it. I did have some problems with the clamps sticking to the glue, so when I did the last piece of missing veneer there along the bottom, I ended up using a little piece of cellophane between the clamp and the body, and then the cellophane peeled right off, so that worked out a little bit better for me. Yep, there we go. You can see that came together really nice. If you look at the line where the heel block would be, it really cleaned up. If you really look at it close, of course, you can see where the break is, but I was happy with the way all that veneer that was peeling off really locked down. Now, I intentionally stayed away from that bottom part next to the binding, that missing piece of veneer right there, because I wanted to lock down all of it together, and I wanted to have a little bit of flexibility if I needed to kind of slide this little piece of veneer underneath. And like I say, I salvaged this piece of veneer from underneath the fretboard where it pulled part of the top off. So just kind of trying to get it fit in there. I ended up trimming it with a razor blade a couple of different ways. Got it locked in, and here's actually the removal of the clamp. And you can see that that little piece of kind of cellophane I had on there was kind of looking like a big glue spot, but came out pretty nice. And then I just used a razor blade and scraped off some of the glue, did a little bit of sanding, and got prepared to put just a little bit of stain on there to see how well we could hide these repairs. Now, I'm not going to spend a ton of money trying to perfectly match this, so I just used some stains that I had in the shop. And by the time I get done putting lots of coats on, it really came out pretty nice. And you will see kind of a preliminary result here. I take some close-ups at the end, but this is just with the neck dry fit. And you can see how, I mean, it really hid fairly well those little broken veneer spots. And so I dry fitted it just to test how things were coming together before I went and did any gluing whatsoever, just to make sure that I had a reasonably good fit. So next step, glue the neck onto the body. So here you can see again, that's kind of the top view of all those little repairs. Now, I missed the glue up on this, but essentially it just involved dropping lots of glue and making sure that the coverage was really good, and then mating those surfaces together. I clamped the fretboard down to the body, and at the same time I put pressure on the heel block, pulling it towards the tail of the body to be able to get as tight of a fit as I could. I didn't have a great clamp for that, so I just used a pipe clamp and made a couple of cauls with rubber gloves stuffed with paper towels so that it didn't mar anything up. And then there was quite a bit of cleanup to do on that one. I didn't do a very good job dealing with squeeze out, so I just took a razor blade and started doing some scraping, which makes kind of a nice sound. So cleanup was, like I say, a little bit more than I wanted to do, but in the end, I ended up getting a pretty clean result there as well. Next step was to do a little bit of just touch up on some of the finish on the ukulele. So I had some like 220 grit sandpaper, and I just wrapped it around a nice square piece of wood so that I could float those areas in, and then I touched them up with some more of this stain, which turned out to be a pretty nice match for what was already on there. The ukulele, really, this is looking pretty brown here, but it's a little more red. The wood is Paduke, and so that finish I ended up putting all over the ukulele to kind of help everything blend. There was, for some reason, on the side here, a light spot, and so I just did a little bit of work with some fine sandpaper, and the finish on these is actually thick enough that you can do a little sanding and not mar them up too bad. You can see just even wiping it clean, it's not losing any of its color or any of its luster, really. And I went back over it with a little bit of stain, and then I'm gonna hit it ultimately here after I get the stain on, let it dry with a little bit of a spray-on lacquer. And it ended up hiding a little bit better here after I got more coats on. All right, now that the neck's back on and the body is pretty much ready to go, I start working on what ended up being the smallest but most difficult part of the task. Took some calipers to measure for the nut. I was given a nut blank, and the blank was well oversized. So to whittle this nut blank down to the appropriate size ended up being really a long process. Lots and lots and lots of filing. I didn't really have a better way to do it. I don't really know if there is a better way to do it. But you want that nut to fit in. There's a little slot between the fretboard and the veneer that's on the headstock. And so you've got to get that width just right so that it kind of slots in and holds itself. And you'll see at the end of this how after probably 45 minutes of filing and then measuring and filing and measuring, I ended up getting a pretty nice fit. The headstock that you see at the lower right is actually a ukulele that I built from scratch, and that was my first experience with making a musical instrument of, you know, some complexity. And quite frankly, it's not that great of an instrument. It plays, but it doesn't sound very good. Everything is way too heavy and overbuilt. So I've already cut some really razor fine slots into the nut in the places where the string should slot through, and then I used some files that are specifically made for nut slots to accommodate for the strings. And quite frankly, the spacing was it was difficult. It was close, but it wasn't quite right. And I ended up having to use a little baking soda and super glue trick to put material back onto the nut and then move the location of the strings. But here I'm just kind of checking, you know, are my nut slots okay in terms of how much spacing I've got from the outer part of the fretboard down, and back to filing. It was about when I got to this part of the project that I could really see why a music store would be willing to just give away this type of a ukulele, because even if they wanted to have it fixed, which it was fixable, it would come out as not perfect for one. So are you going to be able to sell that really at full retail when it isn't perfect? And two, if you are paying somebody who is really skilled at instrument repair, how much would it have cost? I mean, even if I were to value my own time at like $20 an hour, I would have far exceeded the cost of a new ukulele. So somebody who's a professional repair person that might charge $40 or $50 an hour, you know, it just wouldn't make sense to do this type of repair. But I did get it back together, and here we're getting some strings on and tuning. Those strings came on and off multiple times. I figured out that there was an issue. I couldn't figure out why, but I was getting a buzz on that highest string. And so here you see me taking the nut back off to adjust it. Ultimately, I had to put a shim under the saddle on the opposite end. And I think what happened is when the neck glued back on, it was at a tiny, tiny bit of a back angle. And so I needed more string.
Actually, a fret problem.
That's what I'm saying. I think it's a fret problem, but no, it ended up being a saddle problem. So here is the ukulele pre-work. And here are those veneer, I guess, repairs. Looking really nice. And so here we go for a little. All right, so it's finished, back together. It's kind of been cleaned up and polished up. It looks pretty good overall. And I had to do a lot of adjusting. This part right here, this little plastic part, is called the nut. It kind of guides the strings through and sets their height up here above the first fret. And you can see, I mean, it's pretty low down to the fret. But it wasn't quite right, and I had to move some things around, so I got to learn some new skills. But overall, it plays pretty well. Sounds nice. It's a ukulele, so it's not a grand piano, and I don't think it has to be like insanely perfect. It's certainly playable in the condition that it's in, and it was a great learning project for me. So seems appropriate. If you have an instrument that is functional, you can roll it out with a little song. So no better song than my mom's favorite song. Wise men say only fools